You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast. I am your host, Billy Galanko, and today we have one of my favorite guests of all time back on the podcast, José Vouillamoz. He is the famed grape geneticist and one of the driving forces behind the renowned book, Wine Grapes. He co-authored the book with Jancis Robinson and Julia Harding. He has been on the forefront of grape DNA research for years now, helping to uncover the parentage of many of the most famous varieties that we know and love today. This episode really helped open my eyes deeper into specific varieties than our first conversation. Our first conversation, we kept it very high level, touching on different grapes from around the world as we were talking about Wine Grapes, the book, which covers hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of varieties. We were able to really have José open up the conversation on how they conducted research into so many grape varieties from so many different parts of the world. Here in this conversation, we focused on his newest book, which is called Grands Cépages d'origine française, about the top French grapes, both the most famous, the ones you would think of, Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, Merlot, but also a couple varieties that he wanted to highlight as well, like Savagnin and Viognier. So we really get to dig a little bit deeper into one country and their grapes and some of the stories that go along with that, which I thought was really interesting. And then he's also Swiss. And so we got to talk about his first book, which is about the Cépage Suisse, which is about the grapes of Switzerland and the history and origin of those varieties. He's able to give us a ton of great insight into those grapes and wines as well, which I really appreciate after visiting Switzerland this year and getting to taste a number of those amazing wines that they don't really export, made of varieties that you don't really see that much outside of Switzerland. So it was a really great conversation to learn more about these grape varieties that we all think we know really well from France, as well as some of these varieties that you may or may not have ever heard of from Switzerland. And José gives us his great passion for not only grape varieties, but also his passion for own rooted vines and how he wants to continue to tell these stories and pass on this history of grape varieties and their unique nature to the next generation. So he is truly an inspirational force. He has his hands in a lot of different organizations throughout the wine world. And I think he is doing some amazing work by trying to help catalog and maintain this historical record of grape DNA and lineage by identifying these varieties and making sure that they're not lost to the sands of time. I hope you learn a lot, not only about French wines and Swiss wines, but about grape DNA in general, and also go back and listen to our original episode for even more information. Without further ado, here is our interview with José Vouillamoz. Hi, José. Thanks so much for joining today.
Hi, good evening.
It's great to have you back on the podcast. Last time you were here, we focused on wine grapes and talked more about kind of the DNA and ancestry of a lot of basically every grape in the world. At the time, we kind of kept it high level and we dove in on a little bit on a few grapes. Now, I'm excited to have you back to dive in more on a couple of your other books, your Swiss grapes book, as well as your new French grapes book. But first, could you give a little background to our listeners who may have missed you on our last episode?
With pleasure. So I'm what I like to call an ampelologist. So I can see the eyes of people going like that. What? Basically, if you go back to the Greek references, ampelos is the vine in Greek, ancient Greek, and logos is the study. So I study the grapevine. But I study the grapevine through the lens of DNA profiling, combining it with knowledge about history of the vineyards and populations, which is fascinating.
Yeah, certainly. I think you covered it briefly in our last episode, but can you talk a little bit about how you got into the actual DNA side of grapevines in particular? You were doing other work not related to grapevines with DNA profiling, right?
Sure, yeah. So many people call me enologist. That's not correct. I'm not an enologist. I don't know how to make wine. I know a little bit how to drink it, taste it, but not make it. And many people think that I did my PhD in grape genetics, which is not correct as well. So I'm a biologist, became a plant geneticist for my PhD. I was working on a group of bizarre species of plant with DNA techniques. And at the same time, I was becoming more and more of a wine lover, participating to wine tastings, wine clubs, and so on. So I thought to myself, could I combine the DNA technique to the grape world? Yes, it was possible. I was not the first in the world to have this idea. That was back in 2000, 99, 2000. But I was the first in Switzerland. So I did a project research and the government funded me for 1 year in California at University of California in Davis to learn this technique with Professor Carol Meredith, who was the most famous wine grape geneticist back then. And I have learned the technique on Swiss grapes. That's how it all started. So it was my first postdoc. Then there was another one in Italy. And then the virus was in me.
Nice. And I think, so one of the reasons I wanted to have you back on, well, one, I want to talk about your new book, but two, I just went to Switzerland this summer and was able to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole before, during, and a little bit after on Swiss grapes. And I think there's, obviously Swiss wine is amazing. And we don't get a lot here in the US because you Swiss drink a lot of it. Can you talk a little bit about how many native varieties there are to Switzerland, just like high level stuff? Because I feel like people don't recognize outside of Switzerland maybe how diverse of a wine culture there really is there.
It is very diverse, extremely diverse, too diverse, I must say. So when I made the first edition of Swiss Grapes that has been translated into English, the new edition was out in 2025 in September. I'm working on an English edition as well. So in the first book, published in 2017, I made a calculation and we were cultivating back then officially 252 grape varieties in Switzerland. Today, so I thought that was crazy. Today we cultivate 320.
Wow.
On approximately 15,000 hectares. 15,000 hectares is more or less the size of Alsace. And Alsace does cultivate 13 grape varieties. We do cultivate 320, which is crazy. So we have a lot of foreign varieties that were introduced recently, including hybrids from all over the place. Out of this number, I have counted 94 indigenous varieties, but these include hybrids or crossings that have been created recently in Switzerland, and only 31 are historically indigenous. So what I call the heritage grape varieties. 31, including Chasselas, which is the most widespread white grape variety in Switzerland. And these are the varieties that interest me the most.
Interesting. Well, great. We'll dive back into Swiss wine more in a minute. I just wanted to give our listeners when you say you were like starting DNA research just to focus on Swiss grapes, they'll be like, oh, how many are there? It was a big undertaking. And then so from there, that put you on the radar of other wine growers and wine writers around the world. So then that's why you worked with geneticist. And was Julia Harding on that book too? Or
yes, of course.
Of course, yes.
Wine Grape was written by the three of us, the three J's as we call ourselves. Genesis, Julia, José.
Nice. I can't believe I forgot Julia. We had her on the podcast a little over a year ago. She's amazing. So from there, before we dive into your new book, has DNA in the work with, I guess, agricultural products, wine, grapes, plant DNA, has that evolved the technology like a lot with CRISPR or things like that since you first started, or is it still the same general process?
Of course, it has evolved, including techniques that I know theoretically how they work, but I've never performed it myself. When I started in the late 90s, early 2000s, the most widespread technique was what we call microsatellites fingerprinting, or we also call simple sequence repeat in genetic markers. Very simply, you look at a few number of DNA regions that we know that they are stable within the same grape variety and they vary from one grape to the other. And that was very interesting first to identify human beings. It was developed by human genetics. There are more money, more people. So these techniques were made for humans, and the grape community copied this technique for grape varieties. So we were using this technique of genetic markers, which is very interesting because it means we have a huge database of reference material. Then came up another technique called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which is also very powerful, but we do not have the same database with that. And more recently, we have the possibility of doing what we call whole genome sequencing, which means that you read the DNA from A to Z. So the totality of the DNA of each variety. Just for the record, it was done for the first time in 2007 on the DNA of Pinot. Pinot was fully sequenced in 2007, and the project cost was 23 million euros.
Wow.
For one variety. And today, my colleagues tell me I can do the same for $500. So that's why it's developing. But it's very recent. The first paper was out in 2018 or 19, I think, about Nebbiolo. And they were able to differentiate 98 clones of Nebbiolo through this new technique, which is very promising. So yes, it has evolved. But if you want to identify a grape variety, what you need the most is a powerful database to increase the chances of a match. And the largest databases available are with these microsatellites. So that's why I'm still using them for all my works on DNA profiling.
Fantastic. And then you're creating these wine grapes. The main book obviously provided a lot of great information as well as context, but then that's what you're trying to provide in further detail with the Swiss grapes book as well as your new French book. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of the ultimate impetus for the French grapes book and what you're trying to share with the world through it?
So the idea, this is funny because the idea of a French grape book turns out to be grouping 12 of the most widespread or famous French grape varieties. And of course, I sent a copy to Jancis. And she replied, "Oh, it really looks like the first book you suggested me to do together." So for the story, I think it was back, we met in 2008 because I had worked with her already before, working on the Oxford Companion to Wine and the World Atlas of Wine. And I had this idea to publish a book about, I had in my head 15 of the most famous grape varieties in the world, small book. And I wanted to become rich and famous very quickly. It didn't work. And we met with Jancis in London. And since she's very, very clever and she knows what she's talking about, she said, "I like your idea, but what we must do is a book about all the grape varieties that are cultivated in the world to make wines." And I said yes, without thinking any further. So instead of a few months of work, it took us 4 years in the making.
Yes.
So now, with this book, I am filling a gap because I've been giving lectures, master classes, conferences for more than 20 years. And many times people, they like to hear these stories about the origin. This grape went from there to there. It's the same name here. Its parent is this one. Its child is this one. They love it. It's like if you're talking about a friend when I'm talking about a grape variety. So they love these stories. And people would ask me, "Well, don't you have a website with all this information?" They were thinking for free, probably. And I thought, well, this is an idea for a book. So that's what I did.
Ah, great. So this newest book is called Grands Cépages d'origine française. And then, so obviously my American listeners will be able to find it in English soon or in time. It was originally published in French. How did you decide what qualified as the Grand Cépage for this book? And I think it'll be pretty obvious, but have to ask.
Not exactly. But first of all, yes, it was published in French. It's working very well in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, very well in France, also in other regions where they speak French. But I am in touch with a few publishers to have it translated into English next year. So I really hope, fingers crossed, to find the right producer to see this, because I'm convinced that it has an international potential, because all the grape varieties in the book are known by most of the wine drinkers. And the reason of the choice, initially I had chosen 10. And these were the 10 most planted varieties in France that are French in origin. So I'm not listing them all, but if I tell you Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Syrah, Pinot, Chardonnay, etc., everybody knows these names. So that was my choice. But then these were by bearing area in France. They are very important. But then I had another 2 that I wanted to include. One is Savagnin, that is called Traminer in German, because it has a fantastic story. We can speak about that later. It's really, it's not big in terms of surfaces. It's big in terms of importance in history and importance on the numerous progenies that it had everywhere in Europe. So I wanted to include Savagnin. And also I wanted to include Viognier, because it's coming back on the scene since a few decades, but in the 50s and 60s, it was almost on the brink of extinction. So this is an example of the rescue of an ancient and very good grape variety that has been almost abandoned and that is thriving today, not only in Rhône Valley, not only in Condrieu or Châteaubriand, but also abroad where it's becoming more and more planted. That's why I included it. Of course, I can get criticized for not including other varieties like Sémillon, for example. But I wanted also the book to remain small enough for the general public.
That makes sense. So when you're looking at these books, and then are you counting Pinot in the book as one and just as an extended section to talk about all the nuance, or how are you breaking it out? Does it have its own like subsection like it does in wine grapes?
We did for wine grapes. For this book, to keep it short, I decided to include only Pinot Noir. Of course, I have an introduction speaking about what people erroneously call the Pinot family. So there is a small box called "Do not speak about Pinot family," because it's wrong. It's not a family. It's a very old variety that had some genetic accidents in its life, which are called mutations. And some of these mutations have changed the color of the berry. And if you look at my introduction, I have 2 nice pictures of bunches of Pinot. Half of it is red berried, the other half is white berried. And even some berries are half or one quarter, 3/4 different color. So I keep showing these pictures, telling to people, will you tell me that you have 2 different varieties in the same bunch? No, this is not a family. It's a variety. Family is brothers, sisters, uncle, parents, cousins. It's not mutations. To answer your question, I have included only Pinot Noir. I'm not dealing with Pinot Blanc or Pinot Gris and the other ones.
Awesome. Yeah. And if the listeners want to go back and hear you talk more about the Pinot, specifically in the not family, but the different clonal mutations, they can go and listen to our first episode because we covered it pretty extensively there.
It is.
So for here, I really, one of the things, I mean, I have a bunch of questions about your new book, but one is when you identify a grape as X or Y and people think they're planting something else, or you say there's an origin of a grape and people think it's from their hometown, there tends to be more anger sometimes than you would think with people just talking about wine grapes. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some myths or things that you busted in your new book, and then also maybe some producers who are maybe not as pleased to find out that the parent of their grape was something else?
Well, first of all, I must mention that all the discoveries in the book are not made by myself only. I did a few, but I'm gathering all the known and published information about all the grape varieties. So every time I talk about a discovery that was made by colleagues, I mention them.
Nice.
Because I want to be fair. I've always noticed that there is some kind of patriotism in wine grape varieties. People like to say, this is our wine grape. We are the only ones to make it since ages. It comes from here. So we have many stories about the origins of grape varieties that want to make it local or coming from very far. If it's from ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, or the Near East, that's okay, but not from the neighbor. because the neighbor is the enemy. So it makes me laugh all the time. For example, in Switzerland, I was working on the origin of the red grape variety called Rouge du Pays, which means red of the land. And today they call it Cornalin. And it's been shown by DNA profiling that it originates from Aosta Valley, which is today in Italy, just across the border. And people get upset when I told them that this red grape that they love so much come from the valley next door. They forget that this is history. As I told you, it's always fascinating to correlate history and genetics. They forget history, saying that Valais is part of Switzerland since 1815 only. Before that, it was part of the realm of Savoy, together with Aosta Valley, Piedmont, and Savoy. So we were in the same political state for ages. That's why we have exchanged so many things. But still, people always want to say it's from their home. And on the opposite, for Syrah, for example, they have told stories like it comes from ancient Persia, from the city of Shiraz, or the Crusaders have brought it back, or Prince Probus brought it back from Sicily, from Syracuse. And this is the opposite. They want to give it an exotic origin, so it's more appealing to people, like ancient spices that were interesting for rich people to have. And in this case, my colleagues have shown, especially UC Davis and Montpellier, that Syrah was born in northern Rhone Valley, probably in Isère, where you have the most famous appellations, Cornas and José. It's always nice to correlate history and genetics and bring them together.
Are you able to, so you were mentioning earlier that Pinot is a very old, ancient variety. Can you talk a little bit about Cabernet Sauvignon a little bit? Because in the grand scheme of things, that's a relatively young grape variety, isn't it?
Yeah, for Cabernet Sauvignon, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, its parents have been discovered. Its natural parents have been discovered. We know since 1997, again, UC Davis and Montpellier have found that, no, it was UC Davis only, have found that Cabernet Sauvignon is a natural child between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. So we know that the parents are older. And if you look at literature, it's always tricky and difficult to distinguish if the people who were speaking about Cabernet Franc or Cabernet Sauvignon. But we know that Cabernet Franc is older, and Cabernet Sauvignon, of course, appeared later. Probably the first mentions were in the 18th century for Cabernet Sauvignon, and arguably a bit earlier for Cabernet Franc. But the age of a variety is always a mystery, because even if you have a document from the Middle Ages in which it is written, for example, Savagnin, how do you know that their Savagnin back then was the same as Savagnin today? We don't know. We can just suggest that it has not changed and it has kept the name. But maybe genetically speaking, it was different.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, since we've last spoke, I finally finished The Story of Wine by Hugh Johnson and going through, and it's nice to, when he mentions like this will be the first time this grape variety has clearly been mentioned, or this is, you get to track what grapes have been called over time. That's really interesting to me. That's why I think Malvasia is a cool variety, just because of the name can be tracked back to that little island right off there in Greece. Cool. I have a lot of questions, but I want to make sure I'm not repeating from my last time as well. Were there any like surprises or things that when you're compiling like the full comprehensive nature of this between your research and your colleagues, was there anything that kind of came to light that you weren't expecting in this book in particular? Or are there things comments that you've gotten back from readers being like, oh, wow, I actually was not familiar?
So I have two examples that could be surprising to the reader, not to me, because I've known that these facts for a long time. When I'm thinking of, not done by myself though, by my French colleagues, is the parentage of Merlot, which was discovered by colleagues from INRA research station in Montpellier, where they found the missing link for the parentage of Merlot. We already knew that Merlot was most likely a child of Cabernet Franc, but the other parent was missing. And they have been able to discover this other parent by huge chance, almost by accident. And the story of the origin is fascinating because it goes back to the Middle Ages. It goes back to the ancient times where you had vineyards in northern Brittany, close to the sea with the England overseas, where they found a relic vine close to Saint-Malo. Saint-Malo is very famous. We see this small island or tiny peninsula that is visited by millions of tourists every year. Not far from there, they had discovered a relic vine, unidentified. They had no idea of its identity. They made the DNA profile. Then they found another 4 vines identical to this one in Charente, where we make cognac and Armagnac. Again, no idea what it was. People were calling it Raisin de la Madeleine, grape of Magdalena, because Saint Magdalena is July 22nd, and very often it was ripe by this date. So then they found another 3 very old vines growing in front of farmhouses in Gers, in southern France. So total 8 surviving vines of this variety that they called Magdeleine Noire des Charentes, to make it precise. And this was the missing link. It is the mother of Merlot. So when you think of it, Merlot is born naturally from crossing between Cabernet Franc and this very strange Magdeleine Noire des Charentes, and only 8 vines were still in existence. It could have been lost forever. This is fascinating, and it could be a surprise to the readers. And another one that French people, Bordeaux people don't like to hear. I'm not the only one to say this theory is that Cabernet Franc most likely originates from the Basque country, the Spanish Basque country, where it had local varieties as natural children, and it has still ancient populations with primitive morphology. It's called Acheria, which means foxtail in Basque dialect. This is for the shape of the bunches, and this represents the most primitive morphology of Cabernet Franc. And we think that it was born there. It crossed the Pyrenees, probably by the monks who were responsible of the monasteries on the pilgrim for Saint Jacques de Compostelle. I don't know how to say that in English. You know what I'm thinking about?
Yeah, we know what that is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then went up to Bordeaux area, Gironde, and later on to Loire Valley, where it's making fantastic wines today. So this is the journey of Cabernet Franc that is the most likely hypothesis on its origin, and this might surprise readers, especially those from Bordeaux.
Mm. And so that, along with Grenache, would probably be the most well-known French grapes that were born in Spain. The other grape I wanted to ask about was Chenin Blanc. Was that, obviously you go into detail here. Do people in the Loire, well, I guess, number one, the Loire claims it was born there. Number two, at least from my understanding, I'd love to hear if it was different. And number two, are there people within the Loire claiming like we're more the birth area of Chenin, or is it impossible to tell really?
Well, Chenin, just like Sauvignon Blanc, Chenin Blanc was most likely born in the Loire Valley. I've never heard any other region claiming for its origin. And local people in Loire are convinced that it was born there. We have ancient historical documents speaking about Chenin. And what is interesting is the parentage that has been discovered for Chenin. Not a complete parentage, but we know that Savagnin Blanc crossed 3 times in different places and different times with the same variety, but we don't know its name. But we know, based on statistics and probabilities, that Savagnin crossed with the same grape variety to give birth to 3 grape varieties that are brother and sister, which is Sauvignon Blanc, Trousseau, which is called Bastardo in Spain, and Chenin Blanc. So they are 3 brothers and sisters. And the most likely explanation is, especially for Chenin and Sauvignon, is that they were born in the Loire Valley, and Sauvignon Blanc went downwards to Sauternes area and Barsac area whereas Chenin Blanc remained in the Loire Valley and
Awesome.
also in the Jura.
You don't have to give too much away from the book, but so is Sauvignon, Sauvignon, is that originally from the Jura area, the Jura, that mountainous area, or did you find that kind of migrated there and then down the Loire?
So you speak about Savagnin, right?
Sauvignon, yeah.
We must be careful of the pronunciation. It's not our fault, it's history. You have Sauvignon, which I was talking about before, which is a child of Savagnin.
Right.
Not my fault.
Many of our listeners, I don't think they realize that outside of the United States, the Blanc is often dropped. People just say Sauvignon, and that's whatever, Sauvignon Blanc, and it's commonly understood. So anyway, go on.
And they don't speak about Savagnin because it's rarely mentioned on the label.
Exactly.
But Savagnin is most famous for vin jaune from Jura. Its origin are more difficult to pinpoint on a map because it's super old. We have 2 or 3 very, very old varieties in Europe that gave birth to a lot of progenies: Pinot Noir, Grape Blanc, and Savagnin. And they were very important for the Western European viticulture. And they have a long history, which means that we have ancient documents in different regions. We think that Savagnin Blanc, so the vin jaune grape, originates from northeastern France. Yeah, northeast of France, which is called Franche-Comté, the most likely place of origin. It is called Traminer in southwestern Germany. Maybe that the origin also encompasses this area, but it does not come from Tramin, which is a village in northern Italy, Sud Tyrol. This is for sure. It has never been mentioned there historically, and probably that the name Tramin was famous for sweet wines based on muscat. So making sweet wines, especially in the Middle Ages for the royalties, they used a famous name for this grape.
Yep. Yeah.
That's what we think.
Yeah, it has a sort of branding and marketing purposes.
Same for Malvasia.
Yeah.
The name Malvasia has been given to Pinot Gris, has been given to Vermentino, to many varieties, because it was famous for desert wine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I talked about it a little bit in a previous episode. I just find that's so fascinating, and I think more people should read about the history of wine names or wine grape names, because I think a lot of people, like to your point, like to claim this is that, and it's just sometimes it's impossible to tell just because of the way etymology's changed over time. Fascinating. Well, let's go for the back half of the podcast here, or the back third or so. Let's go back to Swiss wines. I want to share a little bit more there. Obviously, everybody stay tuned for the English version of the French book coming out next year. Fingers crossed, maybe. Les Grands Cépages d'origine française. But let's move into your first book, which is available in English already. And I had such a great time tasting wines in Switzerland. I didn't get to visit as many or any vineyards as I had hoped, even though you gave me some great recommendations. But I would love to talk about Cornalin, which is probably, like you said, one of the most well-known grapes in Switzerland, but it makes fantastic wine, so brightly. And then there are other grapes like White Merlot that tend to be widely grown that I would love to learn more about, and some other Swiss varieties along with Chasselas that you could share.
Okay. With pleasure. Yes, the book already exists in English. It's available on Amazon only. It's for Kindle Direct Publishing. I hope to have time to make an English version, maybe also earlier next year, also available on Amazon, of the new edition, because it has more information, updated information about the surfaces, the winemakers that I'm suggesting, and also a few varieties that did not exist or were not commercially cultivated before that have been in the book. So you speak about Cornalin. This is a complicated story, and it's not my fault. We go back in history. Cornalin is the name for a variety in Aosta Valley. It was described in 1838 for the first time by a writer. And then at the same time in Valais, we always had another grape variety that was simply called Rouge or Rouge du Pays, which means red of the land. Because it was clear, everybody had this, it's the red of the land. And in 1972, the guy who was responsible of viticulture in Valais decided, he just wrote a book about Aosta Valley varieties, decided, okay, there is a variety in Aosta Valley almost extinct. Its name is Cornalin. I think the name is nice. We have Rouge du Pays. I think the name is not nice. It's difficult to sell. So I suggest that we borrow the name to the Aosta Valley variety. It's written. He wrote an article about that. This was in 1972. So it 50 some years ago. It's not that much, historically speaking. By the way, he says he borrowed. I say he stole, because as far as I know, when you borrow something, you give it back. So they stole the name to Aosta Valley for another variety that is giving today some of the most exciting wines of Valais. That is true. It was on the brink of extinction in the 60s and 70s, only 5 vineyards remaining. And this same guy did well because he improved the viticultural techniques for this variety that is difficult in the vineyard, and improved the yields and the regularity. So they did a great work also making better wines with this variety. It's just the name that is not correct to use. And I have worked one more chapter on this Cornalin, or Rouge du Pays. I have worked on its parentage. And in 2003, I have published an article about its parentage, saying that most likely I had found the natural parents of Rouge du Pays. The two are from Aosta Valley. Petit Rouge, which means small red that you find everywhere, and Mayolet, a bit more rare. So in this article, there was, in my DNA study, one discrepancy out of 50 DNA regions analyzed. And I said in this article, if this parentage is not correct, then the parents are extremely close to either Petit Rouge or Mayolet, if this is not correct. But then for 20 years, I've told the story, okay, I have found the parents. And this year in spring, some colleagues of Agroscope Research Station, which is the national research station, they were studying the heritability of the genes for the color of grape varieties for another purpose. By doing so, they observed that my parentage was not working with these genes, which is fascinating because what they were doing could not allow to identify a parentage, but it allows to reject one parentage. So it turned out that it's not possible. And in my book, since the new edition was out in September, I had to include this new discovery, saying, okay, this parentage is not true, but probably that one of the parent is correct. And this Rouge du Pays has direct parent offspring relationships with 6 grape varieties from Aosta Valley. So either it is the father of all 6, or the son of one and the father of all 5. Only 2 possibilities. That means that he was certainly born in Aosta Valley. You cannot go from Valais to Aosta Valley, have 6 children, and come back incognito. This is not possible. Humans can do that, but not grapes. So this is the state of knowledge. You spoke about Merlot Blanc. I was wondering, why were you speaking about Merlot Blanc?
Mainly because we were in Lugano. There was a lot around, and I was just interested to learn more.
Yeah, well, Merlot is the most important variety in Ticino, which is the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. And we know that it was introduced in 1906 after the phylloxera attack, the phylloxera plague. And it has replaced all the ancient grape varieties. But they were doing Merlot everywhere, and they were in need of a white wine. So instead of planting a white wine, they had the idea in 1986. One enologist, had the idea of making a white wine out of the red Merlot.
It's just a Blanc de Noir? Oh, that explains why it tastes the way it does. I don't know why I didn't figure that out.
It is a Blanc de Noir. In grape collection, there is a true Merlot Blanc, which is Actually, it's a child of Merlot Noir and Folle Blanche. Folle Blanche is the grape used for cognac, mainly.
Wow. So that's what I thought this was. When I looked it up in the grapes book, I thought it was the same. Oh.
Merlot Blanc does exist, but it's not what they plant. It's a Blanc de Noir out of Merlot Noir. And I think today, 25% of Merlot Noir goes for Merlot Blanc.
That explains a lot of the way it tasted. It tasted more like a Blanc de Noir in terms of ripeness and acid profile. Interesting. Okay, great. Well, let's go back to actual varieties that are Swiss. Can you share a little bit more maybe about Chasselas and some other varieties that you think are really important or exciting?
Yeah, Chasselas, of course, I worked on its origin. It's very old, and like for many old varieties, its parents are older. Every grape variety, as we discussed the previous time, has two parents. So Chasselas had two parents, but since it's very old, the parents have most likely died and they have disappeared from the planet. So it's an orphan variety, as I call it. But I wanted to figure out what was its origin, genetically speaking, and also from historical documents. And putting together genetic studies, I studied more than 500 different varieties and put Chasselas in the middle to see where it would fit. It's genetically close to many varieties from Eastern France, Northern Italy, and Switzerland. But I cannot be more precise with that. Looking at history, it is called Lausannois. Lausanne is a famous city of Switzerland in ancient documents. And around Lake Léman, or Lake Geneva for some people, we observed the highest biodiversity within Chasselas, within the grape variety, which means biotypes or different types, different clones. They have identified 380 different clones of Chasselas so far in this area. And in many cases, where you observe the highest biodiversity, it means that it is the origin of the grape variety. So Chasselas most likely originates from around Lake Geneva. And for me, it's a fascinating variety because it's one of the best varieties to express the differences in terroir. You know that there are many discussions about what is terroir. Does terroir exist? Some people don't believe in it. Just come to Switzerland, go to a vigneron, go to a winemaker, and taste 2, 3, 4 different Chasselas made 100% the same, but from different terroir, and you have the answer. The effect of terroir is there. So Chasselas is for me fascinating for expressing the terroir. And also, finally, it's an enological mystery because it's a variety that gives wines with natural low acidity. For some people, a bit too dull. And with its low acidity, it can age fantastically well. It's amazing. I've had Chasselas, when was it? 2 days ago with friends at home, I opened a 1997 Desalé, which was fantastic. It can age beautifully without acidity. This is fascinating.
Wow. That is really interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way. I just thought maybe some of the older ones I had. Yeah, that's interesting. And then the other interesting part is that it is pretty, I guess it can be adaptable to different types of terroir. Like I even was down tasting in Baja, California, in Valle de Guadalupe, and they grow Chasselas down there too, which is last place I expected it.
Yeah, I've seen many Chasselas when I was visiting the south of Chile, for example. In Secano region, close to Itata, they are growing Chasselas, and of course the typology is completely different. But it's really fascinating. There is a wine competition in Switzerland every year called Mondial du Chasselas, and they are now getting samples from various places. Of course, Switzerland the majority, Germany, southern Germany in the region called Markgräferland. Also a little bit from France. There are some Chasselas in Alsace and in Puy-sur-Loire. But now we have samples from Chile, samples from California, from different areas. From Australia, not yet, but maybe one day. They are planting everything over there.
In your opinion, where does it grow best, or what type of terroir makes the best expression in your opinion?
Oh, definitely in Vaud, definitely in Lavaux. So Vaud is the name of the canton, Vaud, and Lavaux, Labaux. is the name of these fantastic steep vineyards on the slope with terraces between Lausanne and Vevey, which is part of the UNESCO World Heritage since 2007. And I was born in Valais, where they make Chasselas, where they call it fondant, which I like, but I'm not too patriotic for that, or not too originally for that. I prefer the great Chasselas of these vineyards. The most famous names are Desalais and Calamo, the Grand Cru. These are the most famous.
Awesome. So what are, if my listeners are looking for a few other Swiss wines to try, I know they're extremely hard to find here in the US, but maybe they'll be over there in Switzerland. What are a couple other varieties to keep an eye out for that maybe are or more native or possible hybrids as well?
Yeah, I'm not really a drinker of hybrids. I know that there is a market for that, maybe a niche market. As a wine lover, I'm drinking them. I will not recommend any hybrid. Of course, there are varieties like Arvine, that we call also Petit Arvine, which is semi-aromatic, very elegant, with aromas of flowers and high acidity. That is everybody's darling. When I go abroad with Swiss wine, it's difficult for people to understand Chasselas and the subtle differences between the terroir. You need to really study it. It's not obvious, but Arvine is like easy. Everybody goes, wow, I love it. Arvine is much more easy to understand than Chasselas.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There are other varieties. I'm not speaking only about Valais. I like Räuschling from Zurich area. Around Lake Zurich, a few people still cultivate Räuschling, which has become very scarce in Switzerland, and other indigenous varieties like Bondola, which is a light red from Ticino. If you want to, in Ticino, you want to change from big Merlots, you go to Bondola, fruity, slightly tannic, goes very well with the local food. Yeah. So there are a lot of alternatives. And you say that your listeners will not be able to find Swiss wines. It's true, because the export of Swiss wine is around 1% of the production, which is almost nothing. But we're working, I'm collaborating with the promotional bodies and producers to increase this volume of export, because we're convinced that Swiss wines are very good. And I'm not saying this because I'm on Swiss. I'm convinced that they are very good. And we have this saying that people think that Swiss wine is too expensive, which is not true. What is true is that we make the most expensive cheap wines and the cheapest expensive wines. So for entry level, the cost of labor and everything in Switzerland is too high. We cannot compete with southern France or with Argentina, Chile, and so on. So yes, entry level will be too expensive. But high-end wines, we make some of the best Syrah in the world. We make fantastic Merlots that at blind tasting were put in front of Petrus and others. And these cost a fraction of the price of the big names. The best Syrahs in Valais cost like $30, $40 compared to $300, $400, $500 in France or in Australia. Same for Merlot. So for high-end wines, the prices are still very, very interesting and attractive for the consumers.
Yeah, that was the one that I had right before I went. The Cornalin was actually at a local wine bar, one of my favorite ones here in Los Angeles, and they were able to pour it by the glass for $15 or something, and it was a fantastic wine. It stood up to way more expensive wines. I wanted to circle back before we moved on too far. What was the grape variety from around Zurich again called?
Räuschling.
How do you spell that?
R-A with the two dots. Umlaut, they call it. U-S-C-H-L-I-N-G. It's in the book. It's a very nice variety. A natural child between Blanc and Savagnin. A natural child that has survived only around Lake Zurich, which means Blanc is a fantastic variety. We spoke about that in the previous episode. It had a fantastic progeny, including Riesling. So Räuschling and Riesling, the names are similar. They both share one parent, which is Blanc. And I had a chance to taste some quite old Räuschling. The oldest went back to 1934. And honestly, they developed these petrol aromas, and you can confuse it with Riesling easily.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Is since those are two such ancient varieties, Blanc and Savagnin, is Räuschling really old as well, like Riesling?
Yeah, we think that the first mentions, but it's not so clear because it was not exactly the name. And this, depending on the spelling, it could be confused with Riesling. Riesling. But we have writings since the 17th century or 18th century speaking about Räuschling, not only in Switzerland, but also in southeastern Germany, where it has now disappeared. It has only survived in Switzerland.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, here to wrap up, what, aside from your books being translated into English, what is on your radar coming up? What are you looking forward to? What developments, what projects are you working on?
I'm working on a few other books already, but it's still in my head mostly and little written, and I don't want to speak too much about that. But I have the intention of publishing a similar book of wine grapes originating from Italy, because there are a lot of stories to tell about Nebbiolo, Sangiovese, Barbera, and all the world-famous varieties. So I would be very excited to accomplish that. And I have also started to work on a book about Franc de Pied vineyards, which means ungrafted vineyards in Europe. These are the vineyards that have survived the phylloxera plague and that are still making wine today without being grafted onto American rootstocks. I'm a member of the committee. I'm the co-president of the scientific committee of the Association Franc de Pied, created in Monaco in 2022, so very recent. And we are working on putting together all the people who still have that kind of ungrafted vines that we want to safeguard. So that's also in my head, the idea of writing a book about that.
Nice.
With regards to projects, I'm currently working with projects in the Near East, where there are a lot of, I cannot be more precise, there are a lot of interesting ancient varieties that have been completely forgotten. I'm trying to make a project for Cyprus, working with Turkey. In the new world, I'm in the process of starting a project in Chile. This is not really for discovering ancient varieties, that could be, but it's mostly to safeguard the clonal diversity. For example, there are some Cabernet Sauvignon vineyards in Chile, very old, 200 years old, which means that when the cuttings of Cabernet Sauvignon were taken from France 200 years ago and brought Chile, this was long before the clonal selection of the 1950s and 60s or 70s in France, and they represent a sample of the clonal diversity that was existing 200 years before and that has been lost in France. So the idea is to safeguard this ancient diversity, to maybe one day to bring it back to France to recover this ancient diversity. So some of the topics I'm working on.
Yeah. Wow. I'll stay tuned. Those are all fascinating to me. I don't know which one more, but yeah, I've heard many people forget that some of those top French varieties were brought over so early or so long ago to Chile and South America, and phylloxera didn't necessarily destroy all of them either. So a lot of those are unrooted as well. Yeah. So great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. As always, we could go on forever, but I think we'll cut it off here. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Billy.
All right. That is our interview with José Vouillamoz. I hope everybody learned a lot about French and Swiss grape varieties, a little bit more about DNA, and maybe sparked your interest to learn about varieties you've never heard of before. But for now, that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another full episode next week. Cheers.